Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Pinelands Speaker Series. This is our first presentation in September, today on September 3rd. We're fortunate today to have Georgieff with us from Ocean County Parks and Recreation. He's been a longtime naturalist for the park system, and he's going to talk to us today about some of the forgotten towns of the New Jersey Pinelands. It should be a very exciting program. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to German.
Thank you, Joel, and good morning, everyone. As Joel said, I'm a naturalist with the Ocean County Parks Department, and we do a number of presentations and trips such as these. And this particular topic, the lost towns of the Pine Barrens, is probably one of our most popular and one we've been doing for the most time. So the New Jersey Pine Barrens has been said to contain or feature the sites of more abandoned company towns than the entire Old West of the United States. The subject was first popularized by Henry Carlton Beck in the early 20th century, who wrote several books documenting his travels and stories that he gathered as he sought out these towns. And those books were titled The Forgotten Towns of South Jersey and More Forgotten Towns of South Jersey. In this presentation, we're going to visit a few of these towns and the industries that they depended on. The New Jersey Pine Barrens is made up of over 1 million acres of the state and is the largest of nearly 24 similar Pine Barrens habitats along the mid-Atlantic states. The early settlers found the acidic, sandy soils unsuitable for the traditional agriculture they were familiar with, and they referred to the area as barren. They moved on to other regions or other occupations, but the name Barrens stuck. But it was soon realized that the vast forests and their mineral resources provided opportunities for other forms of livelihood and hopefully even wealth. The communities built around these enterprises were often isolated from each other and therefore had to be self-sufficient with all of the workers' needs provided in the village. Probably one of the most important and well-known of the Pine Barrens industries was the iron industry. This slide is of the long-abandoned furnace of the Howell Works at Allaire Village. While Allaire is outside what's traditionally considered the boundary of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, it's the only furnace still standing in southern Jersey. The Pine Barrens possessed all the natural resources that were needed for a successful ironworks, the most important of which was the bog iron itself, or the ore. In the Pine Barrens, iron salts would leach from the surrounding soils into the wetlands, where, aided by an interaction with an anaerobic bacteria, the iron oxidized and settled into the sand and gravel. These accumulations hardened into a soft, iron-rich sandstone, which was dug or raised, as the work was referred to, from the banks or the stream bottoms. Oyster and clamshell from nearby waterways provided a source of lime to act as a flux in the furnace. The flux helped separate the impurities from the molten iron. The numerous shell piles left by Indians along the coast long ago were sometimes used for this purpose, and due to their age and slight deterioration, worked even better than more fresh shells. Also, vast forests were needed and were cut and converted to charcoal as a fuel to melt the iron ore. Approximately 1,000 acres of forest a year were required to fuel the average furnace. So these operations usually possessed large tracts of land. The iron making was actually an industry in itself, not only used to supply the iron furnaces. The men who provided the charcoal were called colliers. First, they would cut and stack the cordwood into a cone-shaped pile. Then they would cover the piles with turf and sand. These piles were referred to as pits, with the term being a holdover from earlier methods that used holes dug in the ground to create the charcoal. The pit was then ignited through a hole in the top, and the color of the smoke rising from ventilation holes might result in either new holes being made or existing ones being plugged. When wood is burned in the presence of minimal oxygen, the volatile compounds are driven off, leaving almost pure carbon. After about a week or more, all of the holes are plugged up and the fire is extinguished. When cooled, the pit would then be broken apart and the resulting charcoal would be bagged and taken to wherever it was needed. This charcoal had a much higher heat value than that of wood and could be used for heating and cooking as well as an industrial fuel. And lastly, an ironworks required moving water, which powered the furnace bellows and other machinery used in the operation. This is a diagram of a typical furnace, as would have been found in the Pine Barrens. It would have been built on the side of a hill if possible, so that the ramp where the ore, fuel, and flux was loaded by wheelbarrows into the top would be at a shallower angle. The water from the raceway, which we can see here, would power a water wheel or a turbine, which would then pump air through a bellows into the furnace. That would be referred to as a blast furnace. Then impurities were drawn off that would float on top of the molten iron. When cooled, that was referred to as slag and would be used for repairing the mill pond dam or perhaps roadways near the furnace. And the molten iron would be channeled into molds in the sand. And the branched structure of these molds lent people to refer to the finished product or the intermediate product has pigs, because it looked like piglets suckling at the sow. Now, products could be molded directly from this iron, which would be considered cast iron, or the pigs could be taken to a forge where they would be reheated and pounded by forge hammers, and then bar iron would be created, which was more malleable and could be shaped into various other products like horseshoes, wagon wheel rims, barrel bands, and so forth. This is probably one of the better known of our iron towns. This is the village of Batsto in Wharton State Forest. It was established in 1866 by Charles Reed and reached its greatest prosperity under the Richards family, who owned various other iron furnaces and forges throughout the Pine Barrens. Like most of these company towns, Batsto was largely self-sufficient and had a company store where the workers could buy anything they needed. They would often be paid in company script, which could then be redeemed at the company store. Inside the Batsto store, you can see what a typical company store would have looked like in its day. Also at Batsto, there was a grist mill, which ground grain grown not only on the company lands, but also from nearby farms, and flour and cornmeal were produced here. The grist mill is not operating in many years, but the components, including the water turbine, are still present. Batsto also had a sawmill, which is still standing. This was also water powered. The mill is occasionally run for demonstration purposes and also to provide lumber for historic building repair and restoration. As the Pine Barrens iron industry began to fail in the mid-19th century due to competition from other regions, primarily Pennsylvania, a glass factory was built at Batsto in 1846. This factory specialized in flat glass for window panes and gas street lights. Glass was blown by craftsmen into large cylinders in a swing pit, which allowed the glass to elongate. It was then taken to flattening tables where it was slit along its length and allowed to flatten into sheets of glass, which when cooled were cut and to the desired size for whatever the product was. Batsto, along with several other failed iron tracts, was purchased by Philadelphia businessman Joseph Wharton in 1876 in order to build a system of reservoirs, canals, and aqueducts to send drinking water to his growing native Philadelphia. The New Jersey legislature outlawed such a venture when it became aware of his plans. Wharton then turned to forestry and agriculture on his Pine Barrens lands. His estate was purchased in 1954 by the state of New Jersey and became Wharton State Forest. Another iron town, Atsion, was established by Charles Reed at about the same time he built Batsto. It was established as an iron forge, processing the pig iron produced at Batsto. Subsequent owners added a furnace, making the village independent of Batsto. This is the ironmaster's mansion built by Samuel Richards in 1823 after he acquired the tract. The state has restored the mansion, replacing the previously removed porch on the west side, resulting once again in the building having 13 iron pipe pillars, supposedly representing the original 13 colonies. The original pipes were cast at Weymouth Furnace, which Richard also owned in Atlantic County, and these were destined to be water pipes for the city of Philadelphia. The one-room village schoolhouse still stands, although not in the best of condition. The company store also still stands, which is now used as a ranger station by the state. The furnace was abandoned in 1848, and in the early 1850s, Samuel Richards' son-in-law built a large paper factory on the tract, which was later converted to a cotton mill in the 1870s, using cotton transported from the south by the rail line, which passed through the village. It operated for only a decade and was later used by Joseph Wharton when he acquired the site as a cranberry sorting house. Sadly, the mill burned to the ground in 1977, and the walls were eventually capped with cement by the state to deter vandals from stealing the foundation stones. Another important industry in the Pine Barrens was the glass industry. Herman City, located on the banks of the Mullica River, was to be a planned community built around the glass works. It produced hollowware, specializing in glass domes to cover decorative items such as dried and silk flowers and taxidermied animals. This was very popular in Victorian times. This factory operated for only a few years before failing, primarily due to the financial panic of 1873. Just downstream on the Mullica River was Crowleytown, established by Samuel Crowley. In 1858, New York tinsmith John Landis Mason patented a new way to seal glass jars for canning produce. He contracted with several glass houses to blow the jars, the first of which was the factory at Crowley. So the Pine Barrens has the distinction of the first mason jar. Another glassworks was the Estelle Glassworks, built in 1825, producing both bottle and flat glass. It operated until 1877 and is now part of Atlantic County's Estelle Manor County Park. And the ruins have been preserved with interpretive panels placed around the various buildings, explaining to the visitor how the furnace operated and how glass was made. Now, while most of the Pine Barrens is covered by sand and gravel, some areas had clay deposits close to the surface. This resulted in mining and clay works being established in many areas, with the main products being brick and terracotta pipe and tile. One of the more visited sites is the Brooksbrae Brickworks, built by William Kelly in Manchester Township in 1905. Kelly died in 1908, and his estate was frozen for over a decade while in litigation over his will. It's believed that the clay works had actually never gone into full production, and the factory was burned in a fire in 1915. These are the remains of the drying rooms, which once would have had lids and steel doors. And this is where newly shaped bricks were taken and placed on racks and dried by waste heat from the kilns until the moisture content was reduced enough to be fired in the kilns. A narrow gauge railroad was built to haul clay from the nearby pits and bring it to the factory. And you could still see the supports and the threaded rod that held the track. Unfortunately, this site has recently been discovered by both paintball and graffiti artists and has been made quite not as attractive as it once was. Another occupation that was common in the Pine Barrens, which we briefly mentioned when we were visiting Atsion, was paper making. In 1832, William McCarty established a factory along the Oswego River on the site of a former iron forge. The source of pulp was primarily salt hay and also scrap rope and rags acquired from nearby cities. It was eventually bought by the Harris family and in 1856 was greatly expanded. This is the factory as constructed by the Harrises. The business failed in 1891 and burned in the forest fire. It was eventually added to the Wharton tract a few years later. And as I said, by 1914, nothing was left except for a few of the foundations. Now, not all of our abandoned company towns are from the 18th and 19th century. Some were established well into the 20th century. In 1918, the U.S. entered World War I, with the arms industry woefully unprepared for the war. Along with several other sites, Bethlehem Steel established the Bethlehem Loading Company along the South River in Atlantic County. Here we see the complex under construction with the newly laid railroad tracks supplying building materials needed for the factory as well as the town. The town was located a short distance away, safe for possible explosions at the factory. These are a row of the manager's houses that were along the main street. There were many more workers' houses located behind these. The town also provided virtually everything else the workers needed, from the firehouse that we see here, which is still standing and still being used, a town hall, a school, a bank, a bowling alley, and several stores. This is one of the shell loading plants. The materials were actually manufactured elsewhere and were brought to Belco by rail, where they were assembled in the factory. Construction started in the spring of 1918, and the first shells were being loaded only 4 months later. The plant closed shortly after the war and was dismantled. All the metal parts of the structures were scrapped, leaving only the concrete foundations, which have since been overgrown by forest, but can be explored by visiting the trails that crisscross through the site. The plant had a number of buildings, each separated from the next and connected by either rail lines or roads, so that they would not be destroyed if the adjacent building ignited due to an explosion. Several of the workers' homes are still on the site and are used as dwellings. This manager's house now serves as a tavern. Another industry, or actually agriculture, was the berry agriculture. Now, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, some of the traditional crops that settlers were used to did not do well in the Pine Barren soils. And it wasn't to the mid to late 1800s where they found that agriculture could be successfully pursued if they went with some of the native plants, such as cranberries and blueberries. One of these company towns was Whitesbog. J.J. White acquired the cranberry plantation established by his father-in-law, James Fenwick, and the tract eventually became known as Whitesbog. This is the Whitesbog Company store back when it was still operating. And here it is today, which serves as a gift shop operated by the Whitesbog Preservation Trust. They also conduct interpretive programs for school groups and other organized groups. The cranberry industry once used large numbers of workers to handpick the berries. In this photograph, we can see the water tower near the company store in the background, as well as the large sorting house. Even with development of the cranberry scoop, the work was still very labor intensive. and it was not mechanized until the 1950s. Most of the seasonal workers were Italian immigrants recruited from Philadelphia. 2 villages were built at White Spog to house them during the harvest season, and those villages were called Florence and Rome. The villages are long gone, but several of the more permanent workers' houses remain on the site. This is a close-up of the sorting and packing house. We can see some of the wooden crates stacked up, ready to be brought inside and loaded with cranberries. Sadly, the sorting house was neglected and has since collapsed. Another chapter in White Spog history was blueberries. JJ's daughter, Elizabeth, took an interest in her father's business and wanted to see if they could cultivate the blueberries, which grew wild throughout the Pine Barrens and had never been farmed before. Together with a biologist from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Frederick Coville, they developed the world's first cultivated blueberries right here at White Spog. The Darlington family, descendants of the Whites, sold White Spog to the state, but leases many of the bogs and continues to cultivate cranberries here under the J.J. White Company name. Here we see the more modern method of harvesting cranberries, which is much less labor intensive. Since cranberries are hollow and float, machines knock the berries off the vines, and then they float on water, which is temporarily flooding the vines. Then conveyor belts take the berries onto trucks, where they are then taken to the receiving station, where they are washed and packaged. One of the best way to visit many of these lost town sites is on one of the Ocean County Parks and Recreation Department's van trips. These trips focus on a number of topics, including lost towns, railroad history, wildflowers, birding, and many more. They are temporarily suspended due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're hoping to reinstate them as soon as possible. You can learn more about these programs by visiting our website, oceancountyparks.org, or our Facebook page, or our printed quarterly newsletter, which is also on our website. Our hard copy newsletter is available for free for mailing addresses within Ocean County. And that's the end of today's presentation. And I believe we have some time for any questions if anyone has them. So I will turn you back over to Joel.
Thank you, German. That was a really nice trip around the Pinelands and really hit a lot of those old, lost towns, like you said. In some cases, there's really not much left of them today, but it was great to see the contrast with the photos you had, where you could see what they were like and then what was, unfortunately, what's left today in some of those cases.
Yes, it's, as I said, it's probably one of the more interesting topics of the Pine Barrens, and many people were motivated by Beck to follow in his footsteps and try to find these places on our own. Beck didn't publish any maps, so half of the fun of visiting these places often is finding them on your own. It certainly was for me.
Yeah, I was fortunate to grow up in the area too, and I heard all these old sand roads that went to really where I thought was nowhere, but a lot of the roads had names like a lot of the towns you mentioned, and it was neat over, as I was growing up to kind of see what road went where and actually find out the history behind the towns that were at all these different little places.
Yeah, that was always an interest of mine because I knew these roads had to be built for a reason, and trying to see where they went and research what they possibly were built for. And as you said, most of them have names, and many of these names are kept alive by the New Jersey Division of Forest Firefighting, because when they have to report the location of a fire that's spotted from one of the fire towers, they need to give a verbal description of where the fire might be to the brush trucks, which are the first to arrive on the scene. So they have names for every one of these roads. And if a road doesn't have a name, they make one up.
Uh, yeah, that's one of the things I always pay attention to every time there is a forest fire. I look to see the name of it and try to figure out why or where exactly they came up with that name. Sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it's just whatever they come up with, usually in a hurry. So you're never really sure what the names are going to be.
Right.
Are you able to swing that last slide up that has the question phone number for people to call in?
Oops, I don't have that on my presentation. Is that, I believe that was on our, the email.
Right. The only snag is I guess we need to try to put it on the screen so people can see the number if they have questions and would like to call in. I can tell people the phone number. I have that right here.
Yes, I have that in front of me as well.
Okay. Yeah, if you would like to read the phone number and the meeting ID number, then that's all people would need to call in and ask any questions if they have a question at this time.
Okay, that phone number is 1-929-205-6099. And this is the first presentation that I'm doing as part of the Pine Barrens series. So I apologize for that little glitch and not having the number on your screen. Again, 1-929-205-6099.
No worries, German. That's okay. And folks out there, you would also need the meeting ID number, which is 826-4353-9321. And German, I have that slide myself. So what you can do is end your screen share, and I'll pull up my screen share, and I should be able to show that slide actually. So I think we can solve it.
Okay.
All right. Let me minimize.
And for those of you that may be viewing this on YouTube after the fact, you can always call Wells Mills Park. Our phone number, of course, is online, but it's 609-971-3085. And we have a number of naturalists here who can answer your questions on not just this, but a variety of other topics. We're constantly contacted to identify flowers, snakes, and other historical subjects as well.
Okay, I'm pulling that right up. So hang with us, folks. We'll have the number and the ID for your viewing within a momentarily.
While Joel is doing that, I wanted to just add a few of the other things we offer. A big part of what we do is natural history and cultural history education through trips and presentations such as this. But we also have an active recreation program, which is hiking, canoeing, kayaking. So if you want to enjoy the Pine Barrens in a more recreational fashion, we have passenger vans that we take people all over the state. We hike virtually every corner of New Jersey, including even going into New York State a little bit. And you're transported to these sites. You have a naturalist guiding you, so you don't have to worry about getting lost. While they're not nature walks, we do a little bit of talking about the nature and history we see along the way. Many of the sites that we hike, such as Wawayanda State Park, were once the site of ironworks, and Wawayanda also has an iron furnace standing. And then we canoe many of our rivers and other waterways of the park, kayaking in some of the more open waters, canoeing and kayaking on the rivers. So we offer a lot of opportunity for recreation as well.
I'm pulling up the image right now. Okay.
And I might add that I'm coming to you today from Wells Mills County Park in Waretown. It's one of our largest county parks and has over 20 miles of marked hiking trails. So that's probably the single biggest draw of this park. But we do have a nature center with some displays on the Pine Barrens and a few of the animals that might be found here. And we have several other nature centers fulfilling similar functions. Jake's Branch County Park in Beechwood, Caddis Island County Park in Toms River, and Cloverdale Farm County Park in Barnegat, which focuses on the cranberry industry and is actually the site of a former cranberry bog.
Thank you, German. We do have a question, and the person is live on the air now.
Yes.
Good morning. Thanks very much for a fascinating talk. I wanted to follow up with a question about Crowleytown and the first mason jars. I'm wondering if any of those original mason jars still survive, and you know, what kind of market value they might have, where you might find them. You know, anything more you could tell us about that mason jar history?
I know some of them still survive. I've seen them on a glass collecting websites, which there's many different organizations that clubs that involve bottle collectors. I've never had my hands on one myself. I do have a very small collection of bottles I found out in the woods. I usually don't buy them from antique stores. I find that kind of cheating. But I wish I had one in my own collection, and I cannot unfortunately attest to their value. But they do, since glass is a fairly, although obviously breakable, it's a durable product, unlike wood and paper products. So it can last a long time. So they are out there, and I've seen them on websites.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you very much. Very interesting talk.
Okay. Sorry, I couldn't
Bye-bye.
give more information than that.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the golden gems of the Pinelands. If you could ever find one of those mason jars with Crowleytown embossed on the side, it would be worth, I would say, a fair amount of money.
Yes, I have a few other bottles that were made in the Pine Barrens and had the name on them. One that came from Barnegat, our newly built rail trail, built on the Barnegat branch of the New Jersey Central Railroad that went from Beechwood down to Barnegat, had a bottle works in Barnegat, which was adjacent to the railroad. And you could still see broken glass and parts of the structure along the trail.
Yes, hello. We have another caller. You are live on the air.
Hello, is that me?
That is, yes. Thanks for calling.
Okay. Thank you. I am trying to find out the name of the town that was built by Bethlehem Steel. I didn't hear what the name of it was. The loading town.
Yeah, that was Belcoville. It was actually
Belcoville.
It was taken from the name Bethlehem Steel. And there were two components, the factory and then the actual town that were adjacent to one another. The factory itself is now part of Estelle Manor County Park.
Okay, that's good to know. I have enjoyed Caddis Island Park on several occasions with my dogs. It's a lovely park, a lovely place to take photographs and walk around. And I've taken my mother there on a couple of occasions. She walks with a rollator, and it's level enough and generally smooth enough that and hard packed enough that she can get to some sites and enjoy the nature. It's a lovely park.
Yes, it is. I started my career with the county of Caddis Island for about 7 years. So I still have a warm place in my heart for it.
Yeah, I love the butterfly gardens there too. Thank you for doing the presentation. It was very nice. Thank you.
You're welcome. And that's another thing about our parks. They're spread over a variety of habitats in our area. So Caddis Island, part of which is a peninsula that sticks out into the bay, and you can view and learn about a variety of coastal habitats. And here at Wells Mills, we're out in the middle of the Pine Barrens. And then we have another one, as I mentioned, that's on a former cranberry farm. So you can see a variety of what the Pine Barrens has to offer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'll still hold for some more questions. We have a couple moments here, and I'll just see if there's anybody else that's going to call in at this time. That's one of the neat things about this program. You know, it's always new. We're always experimenting and learning, and it's not a set science. So thank you for bearing with us with some of our technical difficulties today. You know, we're, as Gervin said, we're in a lot of ways, we're learning as we go in this new virtual world.
Especially older folks like me that maybe are better with the nature and history than I am with the technology. But that is why I had kids, like many of us.
Yeah, I've learned a lot from my child in particular, just like you're saying, about how to do things that in a different way than I was used to doing, particularly growing up.
And again, if anyone thinks of a question later on, you're welcome to call any of our parks. We have naturalists at most of them who are can answer many of your questions or point you to the people who can. When I was at Caddis Island, that was almost a daily occurrence. People, they knew we had snakes and turtles in our nature center, and they would find one in their yard. They wanted to know what it was. Was it dangerous? Identifying plants as well. So that was one of the services that we offered. The one thing that we don't offer, which unfortunately we're called on quite a bit, is injured or orphan animals. You have to be a licensed rehabilitator, licensed by the state to do that. So whenever someone comes to us with that problem, we usually refer them to one of the local rehabilitators, of which there are several in our area.
Speaking of that, in a future program, I believe towards possibly the end of October, I think we're going to have one of those organizations. I think the Cedar Run Wildlife Refuge will do a virtual presentation for us with some of their critters, maybe some they have rehabilitated, and they are located in the Medford area. And that would be one of those such rehabilitators where if you found an injured animal, you could call them and they may be able to help and provide assistance and try to rehabilitate the animal, in many cases with an effort to be able to, again, release it into the wild.
Yes, that's a wonderful facility. It's been around for some time.
All right, German, I think we're going to wrap things up. I see no other calls coming through, and I just want to thank you again. That was a very detailed, very organized presentation, and really gives you know, a great flavor of some of the lost towns and lost history, particularly tied to the industry that once was here in what we refer to as the Pinelands or the Pine Barrens. So thank you very much.
Well, it was a pleasure for me as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. With that, we're going to sign off, and we'll see everybody next week. Next week, we have a program that's going to discuss the Mullica River area or river basin, and it's going to be by the Jacques Cousteau National Estuary Research Reserve, which was an area put in place that helps monitor the Mullica River in Great Bay. And they're going to tell us all about the reserve and what some of the neat things they have going on here in the area, looking at the resources of the Mullica River and the Great Bay. And with that, I'm going to sign off. See you all next week and see you out there.